Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we're going to be doing another community-driven video, this time discussing the Battle for Azeroth global cooldown changes that have been plaguing some people on the alpha. And we're going to talk a little bit about what was said about them, how they were introduced, and how they progressed through the first few builds of their iteration in the alpha. I'm going to talk a little bit about the repercussions of this, and a little bit about the legacy of this. And I just want to start, I'm going to just start by saying that, I'm somebody who's been playing the game since the very beginning. And obviously many of you know that I've been somebody who's been playing the very beginning recently as well. And, this change kind of surprised me. I think it's probably one of the biggest differences between combat in Classic and Live is that so many abilities are off a GCD, whereas in Classic there's not a single ability off the GCD minus the stuff that's going to be discussed here. And it doesn't really matter. To me, it's just like, it doesn't actually change anything about the way I play the game. So when I saw this, I was just like, it's whatever. We'll see how it goes. And that's the way I looked at it, right? So I'm really surprised to see the reactions that I've seen on this. So we're going to have to try to figure out why, and I don't know if I'm going to do it. I feel once again, that I'm just really on the outside looking in at this community in a lot of ways. I've tried to get more and more integrated into it after the recent developments, but I just can't help but feel like I don't know. I don't know where a lot of these people are coming from. So we're going to try to articulate why. I'm going to give my thoughts on the matter, and then hopefully we could have a discussion in the comments. So anyway, we're going to start by reading Ian's post. This is Ian Hazakosis, Watcher Game Director of the video game. Obviously, everybody knows him at this point. We're going to read the entire post. It's quite long, but it's very important that you hear his words because this is very, very important stuff, and I think a lot of people are they're just missing this, I think, really. I was going to say misunderstanding it, but I don't think they even know what he said. So let's talk about that first. So the global cooldown was so named because it originally was nearly universal. In the early days of WoW, virtually all abilities were on the GCD, with some of the only exceptions being on next swing attacks like Heroic Strike and Maul. Now, of course, we're going to divert here a little bit. If you played in Classic, you would know that this is why Warrior was so overpowered, right? Because Heroic Strike was off the GCD. So you're able to burst with rotational abilities. That never existed in the game, and it hasn't existed since they removed Heroic Strike for damage-dealing tanks. So yeah, very, very important part of that, okay? This is a very important part. For melee players especially, with most instant abilities, the global cooldown was the metronome that governed the rhythm and pacing of WoW combat, including the agile rogue being able to act more quickly than others. Very important. I think a lot of people don't know that it might even still be that way, but rogues have a shorter GCD than, say, warriors, etc. So another reason why rogue was so overpowered in Classic. But over the years, more and more abilities have been taking off the GCD to the point that, depending on class, spec, and talent choice, it's possible in Legion for someone to have up to 10 abilities in their spellbook that ignore the global cooldown. Recently, we took a step back and surveyed the landscape of what did and didn't respect the GCD, looking to justify each of these decisions anew. This process is still ongoing, and further changes may come. So in the very beginning, I probably should have read this, but he said this set of changes reflects an experiment in the latest alpha build. This was like 3 weeks ago. So I think some people are probably saying, oh, well, it's no longer an experiment. They're clearly going forward with it based on the changes that we'll talk about in a little bit here. But I still think that, this is all for testing purposes based on how back and forth things have gone on the alpha. And I'm still really surprised to see how many people are up in arms about it. But anyway, let's keep going. Aside from setting the overall pacing of combat, abilities being on the global cooldown can create potentially interesting choices. If you're in an arena match and are low health, being melee attacked, but so is your target on the enemy team, do you use your next GCD to try to finish off your opponent or to get yourselves out of harm's way? That's a nuanced decision where a skilled and experienced player is more likely to intuitively make the right read of the situation. If your defense and escape tool is off the GCD, then there is no decision. You simply do both. That's probably all that needs to be read, frankly. That's all I needed to hear. It's like, oh, he's actually right about this. And this is something that, as a player who does repetitive over and over and over again iterations on my combat play, my improvement, my progression daily in the game is all through muscle memory. So when the muscle memory is, you're ingrained in this muscle memory, small changes like this can make a big deal. So I could already see where people might overreact to it. But if you read what he says here, it makes complete sense, right? This is a very nuanced decision that no longer exists in the game. And this is something that probably a lot of people actually really liked about Classic. So let's continue. But on the other hand, taking something off the GCD improves responsiveness and opens up avenues of reactive gameplay. Until Wrath of the Lich King, most spell interrupts were on the global cooldown. Back then, someone tasked with interrupting a boss, Reliquary of Souls in Black Temple was notorious in this regard, would often stop using any abilities at all when it was their turn in their rotation, lest they find themselves on cooldown and unable to interrupt. That's technically a decision, but more of a nuisance than a satisfying choice. Similarly, trying to use Lay on Hands to save the day in response to a sudden dip in your tank's health, only to have the spell fail to cast because you executed a standard part of your rotation a half-second prior, simply felt bad. We have no plans to put either of those abilities back on the GCD. Again, second thing that we could probably stop here, but there's more, but we could probably have stopped here. This is all you really need to know. He's entirely right about saying this. At one point, people played the game and they completely functioned at a high level, competitive elements with interrupts and like the quick reaction type abilities on a GCD. The game was perfectly playable, and many people would argue was in a really good state and is still playable to this day in that state. Okay, so it's not really that big of a deal in my book, and these illustrations that he's giving here make a lot of sense. It's quite logical. This brings us to a broad category of abilities that are off the GCD in Legion: offensive burst cooldowns. They're almost always pre-planned and not generally used in response to an unexpected situation. With them off the GCD, talenting into such abilities often just becomes a matter of adding another line to a burst macro without any additional gameplay as a result. In endgame raid and dungeon situations, stacking all possible cooldowns has an outsized impact on someone's total performance. While in PvP, the fact that major damage amplifiers can be applied simultaneously with an outgoing damaging ability, all that stuff there for warriors, heavily limits counterplay and makes worst-case burst damage more severe. So this is, step 3. We could have easily stopped here, right? This is all you need to really hear. It makes complete sense. Most people just stack all their CDs together. It's, pop everything. You hear that all the time. I say it all the time. I have everything up, pop everything, etc. And there's no decision there. You know what I mean? You don't plan your damage like you used to. And that's one of the things that I lament the most about Classic. And I see a lot of people, even in my guild, struggle with. They don't really think about what they're doing, and they don't try to think outside the box with what they're doing. And I'm not saying that putting Dancing Rune Weapon on the global cooldown is going to make me more of an intelligent player, but it will have an impact on how I do the encounter. And I think already it's made a pretty anyway, we'll talk about that in a second. Thus, we're putting most activated offensive cooldowns along with on use offensive trinkets back on the GCD. We will tune these effects around this change. See, for example, the increase the duration of Recklessness in the latest alpha build. So what that refers to is that Recklessness 5-second CD, it used to be called Battle Cry. Now it's Recklessness for Warriors. It's now a 6-second CD instead of a 5-second, or duration, sorry. 6-second duration to add for the extra second of the global cooldown. So it's quite fair, right? See, for example, abilities like the Elemental Shaman Stormkeeper have demonstrated that an offensive cooldown that takes the place of another spell and even has a cast time can still feel very potent. It's a good example. I didn't know it actually worked that way. So, for me to be upset about this, I would have to admit that I was ignorant about it in the first place. I think that's an important point of influence here. Finally, while we wouldn't make a gameplay change solely for this reason, there's some additional upside to being able to better telegraph the activation of a major cooldown via animation and visuals. For example, Battle Cry and Recklessness has a War Cry animation associated with it, but in practice the visual is virtually never seen since it's usually overridden by an attack animation milliseconds later. And I'll speak to this actually. I would definitely agree with this. A lot of these abilities don't feel very powerful because you just press them and they're gone. Like the second you press the button, there's no GCD, there's no real impact. The animation gets deleted by the next ability. And like he says, it's not really something that's a big deal, but it does have an impact on the game, in my opinion. Finally, we read that. When you were used to a specific ability being off the GCD, there is some learned muscle memory that will make for a jarring experience when that changes. I feel like most people have not read this part. Or abilities that have always been macroed together may now need to be split out into 2 separate keybinds. Thus, we realize the initial reactions to the change are likely to be mixed at best. But we're making these changes with an eye towards long-term improvement to the pacing and feel of combat as outlined above. Please play around with these changes and let us know what you think. Are there any specific offensive cooldowns that we've changed in this build that are especially bad? Are there any abilities that are still off the GCD but don't need to be? So the reason we kept going, right, I was kind of alluding to this all the time, We could have stopped at any point, which is probably what most people did. Let's be serious. I mean, if you're watching this, you're probably in the minority. But this is the most important part. He totally, and I think everybody should realize that nobody's going to actually love this, right? This isn't like, oh my God, this makes the game so much better. But it may actually make the game a lot better. We don't know yet because the stuff that we have tested in alpha does not really matter. It doesn't actually require us to play global perfect, okay? So that's what was said, all right? And now recently they added a bunch of new abilities to the GCD, and that's including abilities that are could be seen as defensive oriented as well, like Light of the Protector for prop paladins, a good example. That was added to the GCD. For the most part, most abilities on the GCD currently do make sense. Like, for example, Blood Death Knights. I was really surprised when Dancing Rune Weapon wasn't on the GCD, but now it is, and I think it makes complete sense. Frankly, an offensive ability. Now, I could also agree that it's a defensive ability, and I would not mind it being off the GCD, but it doesn't really matter. To me, it makes almost no impact on it, because when I use it offensively, I would use it on the pull. So what I've begun to do is just pop it before I'm in range. You know what I mean? I pop it as I'm running in. I couldn't have used an ability anyway in that global, because that second that would have occupied a global doesn't exist because I'm not in range to use an ability. So I've used it. That's what I did in the raid testing. It worked perfectly fine. But later in the fights, it made, I realized that I had to slow down and use the ability properly. I couldn't just spam it. And it felt like a little bit more like the old days. You know what I mean? It felt more like I was playing a class that had to make decisions every time I pressed the button instead of just, spamming muscle memory. That's it. You don't think about anything. You just press buttons and that's it. And that's kind of what the game's become for me and I think for many. But like he says, nobody's going to really like this because it's different and it's quite jarring. And now that's the reaction to this. I don't have any reaction to pick on specifically, as I made that mistake in the last video. But I will definitely say that I've been posting a lot on the forums about this. I posted both on the alpha and the live, the general forums. And I'm seeing a lot of replies that are... really the one thing I wanted to talk about for sure on this was a lot of people are saying something like, so here's my reply. This is what I've been saying. I'm like, oh, hey, by the way, guys, don't forget this change was explicitly described to impact the pacing of competitive content. And this includes arenas, rated battlegrounds, raids, Mythic Plus, maybe even scenarios, the island, the PvP islands, anytime where your decisions can impact the success of you and the people around you, okay? That's the way it says. I mean, it literally says that here, okay? And it should be implied that no matter what, even if you didn't read this, it should be quite obvious that this is why it's happening. And people are saying things like, the most extreme, obviously, is like, Blizzard literally does not want us to have fun. That's like, you see that, and it's just like, check that one off the list, right? Because that's just silly. But then, like, the less extreme ones that are trying to make a lucid argument are saying things like, well, it ruins questing. So I said, like, don't forget, this is, we haven't actually tested content where this matters yet. My point was that you can't really say if this is good or bad yet. You don't know yet. You haven't done anything where global precision matters yet. And that's what this is. This is global precision. It's not like they added a whole new global cooldown. Like, it's not like they completely redesigned combat pacing. You have every other ability on your global cooldown. And for most of us, that's like 90% of our presses. You know what I mean? Like, I only use Dancing Rune Weapon maybe three times a fight, and that's pretty much it. So Dancing Rune Weapon and now Death Grip are on the global cooldown. And Death Grip being on the global cooldown means it's a lot harder to interrupt something with Death Grip. And that's probably a good thing, It's going to take me a little bit to get used to that, but it's actually pretty logical. It sucks. Like, when I play it and don't think about what might happen now, it's like, oh man, this sucks. It's harder to do this, But it's like, oh wait, it's pretty overpowered that I can just grip a caster that's not supposed to be interruptible, like the Seers and Archway. I can just grip it without any planning whatsoever. He's casting, grip him, you know what I mean? That's not really very well balanced. And I think this change is going to make a lot more intelligent decisions. And they talked about the situation in TBC. You're going to have more of that too, unfortunately, where people are just sitting on abilities waiting to use them. But at the same time, you're also going to get away from these Swifty macros and these pop it all on one global, and not even one global, one press, and then go your full burst. And I don't know how that's going to affect. I don't play damage dealers. People are saying Fury Warrior, etc. Warrior especially is quite bad. You know, like look at, I mean, even on that list there it says, you know, Battle Cry into Avatar. Now I played a Warrior a bit on the alpha recently, and it doesn't really change. It doesn't really change anything for me. I just pop Avatar while I'm about to charge in, and then the first global of combat I pop Recklessness. It's like what? So what? I lost 1 second on Avatar. It's like it's a pretty long I don't know, man. I'm not really seeing it. It just doesn't affect me, and this is why I was so surprised by it. Like they had changed the stuff about Blood DK and the other classes I played, and at first I was like, oh, this is different. Not really that great, but I've gotten used to it already, and I've already started playing around it. I feel like I've already adapted to it, but no matter what, it doesn't actually impact me in these dungeons. As you guys might have seen this weekend, I soloed a normal dungeon, scaled down to 185 item level, 110 level, and I soloed it without any real problems. There was some difficulty here and there, but I basically had no problem soloing it. So we're doing content that does not challenge our character and does not demand global precision and being asked to judge global precision changes. So when I see that, I'm thinking like, oh, okay, hold on a second. We shouldn't even be talking about this. Again, this is the third or fourth time this has happened on this alpha. They're asking us to judge things that we don't know enough about to be able to judge accurately. And I sit here and think like, Ian, you're an idiot. Like, why are you asking us to judge this stuff? We can't judge this stuff until the raids come out. That's what I'm thinking. I'm like, you're stupid. You don't, like, we can't judge this stuff. I won't be able to tell you if this is good or bad or what abilities should or should not be off the global cooldown until I see how they interact with the environments I'm going to have to progress through. So when I'm questing and doing like dungeons that I could solo, I don't really care. That doesn't matter. And so somebody said to me that if it affects, like, so I said that, you know, I said that it doesn't matter, whatever. And they said, but it, like, there's way more world content than there is progressive content. And if it's bad in the world content, that is the bulk of the content, then who cares if it's better in the progressive content? It's worse for the game overall. Which sounds logical, but it's the reason I don't believe it is because in that content, you could literally just not use the ability. Right? You could kill that mob without using, I could easily quest from 110 to 120 pressing only Heartstrike. I could kill every single mob out there with only Heartstrike. And it probably wouldn't even be that much slower. It would definitely slow it down, but it does not require me to use global precise actions to be able to kill a mob that is going to die in a couple globals. It's not what it's for. This is changing not relevant content. This is changing, okay, this is changing content that is important to the game overall, but is not changing content that struggling with this. What I'm trying to say is it's not affecting easy content, okay? And that's all we have to test. So I'm kind of surprised to see how many people are upset, especially because Blizzard literally posted about how they expected everyone to be upset. And people are, and then, you know, the one thread that really made me want to make this video, thanks for the sub, by the way. I forgot to turn that off. Anyway, the one thread that really made me upset about this and want to make this thread, or want to make this video, was that somebody said that Blizzard is just not listening to the feedback. And this is a whole nother problem. Obviously, a bunch of people on both sides of the arguments make valid points. Who's listening, who's not listening, it doesn't really matter. But saying that so what I said was, you're not actually giving feedback on this yet. There's nothing to give feedback on. We haven't done content where this would matter. As per this post, it says, we're making these changes with an eye towards long-term improvement to the pacing and feel of combat as outlined above, and they're discussing competitive content in this post, which we have not been able to see or do yet, okay? So what you're talking about is you have had a jarring experience when that changes. That's what your feedback has been given. Well, they already said, we realize that initial reactions to this change are likely to be mixed at best. So they've already heard that feedback. So what are you talking, like, what is there to listen to? You know what I mean? And this is the biggest problem for me because people are like all up in arms. I mean, another thread on the alpha forums was like, I think I'm done or something like that. I have to encourage you guys, if at any point these changes do, like, if it crosses your mind that at any point, like, you've heard about this, maybe you've even tested it, whatever, in leveling content on the BFA, and you think, I don't want to play the game anymore, honestly, I think you probably should stop playing the game. I really do. and I'm not being like a dick or sarcastic. I'm serious. If this kind of stuff really changes the way you feel about the game, then I think you've burned yourself out, or you've become frustrated with things that are not necessarily fixable. The game isn't going to be able to make you happy at this point. And the way I've always looked at it was, you know, I didn't actually like Holy Paladin very much in Legion. And I came to a situation where I was able to play a different class, and I enjoyed it much more. So, you know, if they changed Blood Death Knight to a way that I didn't like it, which I don't think is possible at this point, but if they did, I would just play something else that I did like. And if I never found something I liked, then I'd be like, well, that sucks. Maybe I'll stop playing. But realistically, I've been playing this game for 13 years. I'm not just going to quit because a couple more abilities are on the global cooldown. And that's where it really concerns me, is that people are effectively talking about, I mean, how many abilities do you, like how many key presses, not necessarily abilities, but how many key presses do you go through on a 6-minute progression encounter? I don't know. That's a lot. I've never really considered it, but I'd say it's maybe hundreds, if not thousands. I don't know about thousands, but it's probably a couple hundred. So when you have these abilities that are 2 and 3, maybe even 5-minute CDs on a GCD instead of not on a GCD, what does it matter? Like, how does this, it's just a drop in the sea of souls, as a wise man once said before I soloed him. You know what I mean? And it's just not something that has come up into factor. Like, it doesn't factor into what we've tested so far. So if you're watching this, I'd love to hear your opinions on the topic. But please, if you're going to say something about, let's put it this way. If you're going to reply, I hope that you would have listened to what was said, okay? Because I really don't want to discuss, I don't want to have a discussion that I've already had in the video. And I think the Blizzard is in a similar situation. They don't want to have a discussion that they've already had in this post. And that's why people may think they're being ignored. But frankly, it's their own ignorance. They don't read the post. They don't know what's being said about it. They don't understand why it's being changed. And they don't know that what they're reacting to is effectively irrelevant. The content that they're able to play currently, while maybe it does seem like it's unfun to play your spec in now, it's not. You could not use the ability. You could just do exactly what you did in Legion minus those 2 abilities, and you would have the same level of efficacy. And of course, that's expected to extrapolate upon the higher difficulties. So it's understandable that people would want to give feedback on that now, but you can't do that until you've actually made sure of that. You know what I mean? And especially since things are changing many times. You know, they've added even more abilities to the GCD now with the latest build. So we don't know. They're probably obviously not finished with this, but we don't know the full picture. So there may come to be a time where every ability is on the GCD. So then if it was me, if every single ability was on the GCD, then it's just a wash. It just changes the way the game is played, and this is no longer a discussion, which I think a lot of people like about Classic. And, you know, I think a lot of the people who are arguing this the most, they never really played the game when it was like this. Because this was a time where there was a lot of managing of spells and a lot of global clunkiness in the game, yet people still remember it in a way that it was very engaging and very competitive. Even though, frankly, I don't agree with it being very competitive, I wouldn't say that just because your damaging burst CDs are on the global cooldown is going to considerably change the competitiveness of the game. And frankly, we haven't seen if it would yet. So your comments are just talking about stuff that the global cooldown is irrelevant for. I don't know. I just don't understand. But that's my point. And somebody said to me, whatever, like they replied, you know, something. And my initial thought was like, me and this person are not playing the game the same way. We don't have fun the same way in this game. He has fun doing something that I don't care about. And to me, the buttons that I press when I'm fighting trivial mobs are completely irrelevant. But I would much rather more decisions in real content that has relevant globals. For example, when I'm tanking as a Blood Death Knight, if I don't use my active mitigation, if I let my stacks of Marrow Rend drop, if I don't use Death Strike, you know, if I use Death Strike immediately after damage, I could have a much higher impact on my character. So if all of these abilities weren't on a global cooldown, then I would never have any problems. Like, there would never be any decisions to be made as a Blood Death Knight. I would just press all of them at once. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So anyway, if you guys have anything that you want to discuss, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we will see you guys in the next one.